Good. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I enjoyed reading it a lot, but I need to tell you something from the get-go. For publications at the QG. So when I think about my discussion, I'm going to try to keep it short, number one. And number two, you can think of my comments as a kind of a wish list for your next paper. I think you should still work on this. It's a really big question, and others should work on it. And just to show you that it's a really big question, let me go back in time a tiny bit, more than actually 30 years ago. So I'm going to use the reasoning that Lucas used. You look at GDP per capita in India right now, I mean 2023, and you adjust for PPP. You have something like $10,000 per capita. You look at the same GDP per capita in the US, it's around 80,000. So it's basically a factor of 8. So now let's take a Cobb-Douglas function, an AK model, very simple model. Take the first derivative, you get the marginal return, right? I can replace K with Y, and I get the return. Now, think about differences in Y. How do they translate into differences in R, in returns? If GDP is 8 times bigger in the US than in India, then the return on capital, according to this model, has to be 23 times bigger, 23. I didn't say 2.3%, I didn't say 23%, I said 23 times bigger, right? So, okay, Lucas told us that in 1990. That's the title is, of course, the next question that comes to mind. Why doesn't capital flow from rich to poor countries? And people have tried different answers. Maybe we mismeasure capital, maybe the production function is not correct, maybe there are other things going on. And this paper comes and say, well, I'm going to try to estimate barriers to capital allocation, and I'm going to show you that it works. I can explain this. So when I think about barriers to capital allocation, maybe, and also when you think about it, the first thing you may have in mind is some kind of a time series approach. And so here what I'm doing is that I'm starting with a data set of 40 different countries. And for those 40 countries, I'm looking at all their foreign assets. So you see the different components, the FDIs, portfolios, in terms of assets and in terms of debt. And I'm just summing things up and dividing by the GDP of the countries I have in my sample. What you can see is that if you go back to the 70s, foreign assets were something like 30% of GDP. Look now, it's like 250% of GDP. Huge increase, right? So clearly here the barriers to allocation, they must have decreased. And so indeed, when we try to measure how difficult it was to invest in foreign countries, we've seen that a lot of the capital controls have disappeared. And so here I'm using a simple rescaled version of what is the Chin-Ito openness index. And you can think of it as just a way to quantify IMF annual reports when the IMF, country by country, year by year, is trying to measure how difficult it is to invest in a country or how difficult it is to get my money out of that country. And what you can see is that clearly when those barriers disappear, 10 years later, the capital flows in. Now, that's not what this paper is going to do. This paper is mostly about the cross-section. So think of them as taking 2017, that's the year they're going to focus on, and out of that year, let's study the cross-section across countries, how much we see in terms of barriers. So this paper, just in English, and then I'll go for a bunch of equations. They built a very large panel, both across countries and across time, of measures of distances, but not just the geographic distances, but also the cultural, the linguistic, and also the political risk across countries. This is a huge amount of work, and I really want to talk about that later. Once they have those measures of distances, they're going to look at how much the foreign assets relate to those distances. Kind of just a simple regression, as Bruno said. Once I know how much those kind of distances relate to the foreign assets, I'm going to interpret those as wedges. And I'm going to take those wedges, plug them into a big macro model, and use the model to go for some counterfactual. So that's a paper in 3 sentences. Now, my discussion was going to be about, first, a big shout-out. I want to say something about the database. And then I'm going to go for the model, but only focusing on 4 equations. And just out of 4 equations, I'm going to try to tell you the story of what is going on and maybe also some suggestions for the next papers. But the first is the big shout-out for the database. I didn't know how to really convey the impressive amount of work that has been done, but they actually helped me with that, because if you look at their website, you can see the difference between this data set and the previous one. And it does help that the previous one was actually built by both Enrico and Romain, right? And so here you see the differences in terms of data coverage and the amount of information that they bring to bear. This is an amazing undertaking, and I think the fact that they've done that and they built this data set and gave us this for free to the whole profession, I think we owe you a big thank you. So this is really a big deal, right? This is certainly going to influence a lot of work in the coming decades. Now, I'm going to go for the model, and the model I said in 4 equations, or the work in general in 4 equations. So you see the first equation, that's the return that an investor J would get in country A. It's a more interesting version than the little AK model I started with. But you recognize the same ingredients, right? The return depends on the expected marginal return on capital. It's a little bit more interesting because now I have some tax rates that, exactly as Bruno explained, depends both on the investor J and on the country where you invest, country I. There's also a little bit of depreciation and an adjustment for risk. So that, I think of it, this is the macro side of the model. Now, there's another side of the model that we're going to call the finance side of the model, where through some micro foundations, you can derive what is the amount that investor J invests in country I. That depends on the return that investor J expects in country I, some elasticity, the amount of capital in country I, the savings rates in country J. M is just, think of it as just a constant, doesn't really matter. And delta ij is the wedge that depends both on who's investing and where. So it depends both on I and NG. So if you think about that, what would be really fantastic is actually to work even more on the link between the macro side and the finance side. Because when here we go for a micro foundation that is based on the amount of information, like in the great work that Bruno did previously, you would like to see exactly what are the implications for the way we manage the firms or the way we think. When we go for another micro foundation, which is like the trading cost, well, the trading costs are paid, but they're also hidden by someone else, so they could also show up on the macro side. So this, okay, we could work a little bit more on that. But let me now go to equation 3. Equation 3 is this assumption that the log, or just again, the amount of foreign investment, depends on a bunch of distances. This is the amount of work I just highlighted. Huge amount of work in making sure that I have an index of distance that depends both on I and J. Now, they take this to the data and they run this regression. With this regression, they get the coefficient, the betas here. They plug the betas, define the distance, and once I have the wedge, I plug this wedge, I go back to the macro side of the economy and solve the whole model. So that's the name of the game. Okay, so what do I have to say about this? I'm going to focus first on equation 2 and 3. You look at equation 2 and you say, well, okay, that sounds relatively intuitive. If I think about a Merton model, the share I invest of my wealth share I invest in the risky asset depends on the expected return on that asset. I get the return here. Fine. When I go to the next equation and the return is not there, that's a problem. That's a problem because that return depends both on the destination country I and the investor J. So it cannot be absorbed by the fixed effect of country I or the fixed effect of country J. It's all about the interaction between the two. I'm an investor from country J in America, and I'm thinking about investing in India. This is about the interaction, which is exactly the same thing as you capture here with all the wedges. So since the little r, or the expected return, is not in this equation, you could have a different interpretation of your result. And the interpretation of your result is that everything you measured here is a measure of expected returns. You measured the expected returns of the investors. But if you measure the expected returns of the investors, then there are other things you could do. First, you could compare this to the actual returns. You could also compare them to the model-implied expected returns. And it also changes the way you're going to see your counterfactuals. Because it's relatively difficult to do counterfactuals when we change the expectations of investors. It's no longer like changing a policy, right? It's a bit more difficult. Now, what we could also do is bring back R in this equation. Now, if you bring back R in this equation, you're, of course, much closer to your own model. But it's not easy, which is why we're going to need some more work. If we bring back R here, we are regressing quantity on prices. Okay, sure, we can do that. We're going to need to find a way to do this with maybe some instrumental variable or something else. And we're going to have a joint hypothesis going on. I'll come back to that in a second. 5 minutes, perfect. The second thing I want to highlight is something actually Bruno highlighted himself. How do we really test the model? Since we're going to estimate those betas and plug those betas inside the model to define the wedges, we estimate the betas so that we describe correctly the foreign assets. So is it a big surprise in the end that we are able to describe the foreign assets? Well, no. Look at how the foreign assets are determined. If you pick the delta well, the only way your model, once you solve it, the only way for your model to undo what you've done is that if somehow this can undo the impact of delta. How could the returns undo the impact of delta? You remember, the delta, the really cool thing is that they are specific to the investor J and the country I. What is the same in the return? Only the tax rates. Only the tax rates that are specific to the country you invest and who you are as an investor. So for the model to really fail, it would have to be that somehow the taxes undo what I see on the wedges, which is relatively unlikely, right? So what I would like to see is a different way to test the model. And then I think, okay, what do we do usually in finance? Well, we write another equation. E of MR equals 0 if R is an excess return. And then we test if E of MR equals 0 or not. And then we have a lot of tests to just see how far we are from that. Well, let's just go to the basics. Let's just go back to that. That would be very nice. Now, I want to say a few words, but not too long, about the joint hypothesis. You notice that in the model, there's no exchange rates. So I'm going to go from an example with the exchange rates, just for the fun. Any result you're going to find on the wedge depends on your model. So let me give you an example here. I start from 6 portfolios of currency excess returns. So I think about a US investor borrowing money at home and investing in treasury bill abroad. This would be a component of any return of a US investor investing elsewhere. If he or she invests in equity, you would add just the equity premium. If you invest in bonds, you add the bond premium. Okay. What do we see across those 6 portfolios? They are sorted, by the way, on the level of interest rates, from low interest rate country to high interest rate country. This is going for the usual 45-degree line graph in asset pricing. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Expected excess return on the horizontal axis, actual excess return on the vertical axis. On the left-hand side, I use the KPM to explain those returns. And clearly, we fail. So it means that if I take the KPM here, I'm going to interpret this distance here as a wedge, huge wedges. But what if I use a different model? That's going to be on the right-hand side. 2 minutes, that's all I need. I'm going to use a model where I introduce some volatility risk. Well, there, actually, the wedges are much smaller. So any result you're going to obtain on wedge is a test of your own model. What is the only kind of wedge that I can think that is model independent, and that you can call my own home bias? I think it's a deviation from a no arbitrage condition. So I can interpret a CIP deviation as a wedge. It's indeed a wedge. So what I suggest for the next paper is that compute the wedge the way you want, making sure that, of course, the model is consistent with the data, the empirical work, and then look at the magnitude and express those magnitude in terms of returns. Once we express them in units of returns, we can compare them with other measures of wedges that are completely model independent. I promise when I was going to be short, I'm done. So congratulations for being published in the QG. It's a big deal. Thank you for building and sharing these databases. This is a big, big shout out. And the suggestions for the paper would be, okay, let's go for a joint estimation of the wedges and the model implied expected returns. I would add exchange rates because it's on social finance paper. I would test the Euler equation, and I would think hard about this joint hypothesis. I stop here. Thank you.